Okay, I hit record and I coughed right before I turned on the microphone because I didn't want to do that in the microphone. So what I'm trying to say
I
is
had to
all the
too.
listeners are welcome. Yeah, and I'm here today with Miss Catherine Hernandez, uh, a fantastic three-story method certified editor. Uh, and we're going to talk about emotional tone. But before we do, I want to get to know you a little bit because you've been on the other podcast where we've had the other three-story method editors on, but we've never just had you solo. So I'm pumped about you being on
Okay.
solo. Talk to us, just give us your author journey. Where are you at? What you doing?
So I am hopefully going to publish my oh my gosh, my first novel
Nice.
in December. It will be steampunk. So I write dark steampunk fantasy urban
Very
type of.
cool. That's awesome. Yeah.
And
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna say that's pretty much what I like to write. I also do space opera and sometimes dabble with magic, just because why not?
Very cool. How long have you been writing?
I've written on and off as a kid and then got really into it again in high school. Was destroyed by my family, who I handed off a book to, and they were like, "This is really bad."
Oh, that
And
hurts.
it did.
Yeah.
I've learned my lesson
Yeah, yeah.
and
Yeah,
didn't
the
write.
lesson being don't give books to family. That's the lesson.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I didn't write for a few years. And then through college, like I was telling you before this, through like that whole stalker experience, I started writing once again. And that helped me like get through stuff. And I realized that a lot of my writing themes and what I like to focus on is the darker side of humanity and how to come out of it. So the
Nice.
book that I'll be publishing in December is all about the sex slave trade and how women are forced into this or they're stalked, and like how to try to like come out of that by like being in a community and like listening for things.
I love it. That's great. So talk to me about what you are also an editor, working as an editor. What do you like to edit?
I really like historical pieces just because that steampunk side of me is really into like researching history. I love to see if it's accurate. Sci-fi is super cool. I love to read sci-fi. I love to
Nice.
write sci-fi. um, Really kind of anything. The most that I've done would be space opera and a bit of history.
Awesome. And I think it's I know you'll edit anything, that it's like, oh, if you give me something, I'll edit it. But I think it's important for writers to find editors that like and edit in their genre. So like
Mhm.
I can do some scenes in sci-fi, but if you give me a whole sci-fi novel, I'm not your editor. Like I'm not the guy to do that. Because I'll get bored. I'll turn it into lit fic. Like you don't want me editing your sci-fi novel. But so
I'm not
it's
hard sci-fi. I'm definitely not hard.
yeah,
that
yeah.
one takes a lot of would be a lot of research for me to make sure that that stays accurate.
Yeah, you're not doing any like military sci-fi today. I mean, you could, but that's not your bread and butter. But I think that's yeah. Anyway, just to say that's part of the reason I ask you, because I think it's important that readers find editors that like their like reading in their genre.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think it's a big deal.
I'm definitely down for the punk worlds. Punk
So
world.
there's also a lot of different types of editing. There's copywriting, which is kind of what like Pro Writing Aid or Grammarly does, but by a human. There's developmental editing, which is like this is the first draft of a story and it needs help. There's structural editing. There's diagnostic editing. And there's all kinds of other editing. What kind of editing do you like doing most?
So I like to really look or like read through the book and make sure that your plot is strong, your characters are good, your world building is there, that there aren't things that are slipping through the cracks. I like to look for consistency. So as I'm reading through, those are really the things that I'll pinpoint for people. So I'll be like highlighting and being like, hey, this is working, or hey, I think you mentioned this like 4 chapters ago. You can probably just cut this out. So those are
Cool.
things that I like to do when I read through a manuscript. I'm
Very cool.
dyslexic, so
Me too.
for
Those
checking
people are
for
dyslexic.
spelling
Yeah.
is not my thing.
Yeah. Yeah. You don't want me in your grammar. Yeah. It's
Nope.
Yeah, I actually had to run. I'm so dyslexic. I had to run my novel through Pro Writing Aid and then through Grammarly to make sure I got all of the weird misspellings and like
Yeah.
reverse words and all of that stuff.
And then there's, of course, words that are like who and how are my biggest ones that I will
Oh
swap around
yeah,
in a
those
second.
like devil words where it's just like one letter. Yeah, those are the worst.
And
Yeah,
it doesn't get like picked up by any of those things. So the
yeah.
human eye is better for that.
When did you find out you were dyslexic? I'm just gonna have fun
Um,
dyslexic
my,
chat now.
my mom told me, I remember we were doing math and she's like, oh, you're dyslexic. And I was probably in like third grade and I was like, oh, okay. And then we just like worked with it from there.
It's really funny. Yeah, I think I was in second grade because we had just moved to Ann Arbor, Michigan, where I was living as a kid. And I remember I brought home a paper like that I had done in class that my teacher's like, you need to show this to your parents. And I brought it home. I'm like, here you go. And my mom was like, do you do this as a mirror image on purpose? Because I'd like written everything backwards. I was like, no. I was like, it's backwards. So yeah, that's how I found out. And then, tons and tons of weird specialized public school classes later where they're like, everybody else is going to do English and Jeff is going to go sit in a quiet room over there by himself and practice writing a J the right way. Yeah,
And see, that was the opposite. My mom never told any schools. She was
no
like,
way.
get hushed. It'll be fine. We'll work on it, because like the school systems for the 90s were like horrific when it came to like any kind of disability.
Yeah, that was me. I was the kid in the class by myself in the room off to the side. Whereas like everybody else is going to read Of Mice and Men, but Jeff is just going to write the letter A 50 times until he gets it right. That's what I'm doing. Yeah. So yeah. Anyway, that's fun. Okay, let's talk emotional tone. I'm going to share my screen real quick, and I'm going to show people where we get this, because this is another thing. We do these every, I don't know, 6 weeks. We talk about a piece of the story rubric, and I've had complaints like I don't know where to get that, so I'm just going to pause for a second and talk about it. This is theauthorlife.com. This is Jay Thorne's website. If you go to it, this is for people who are watching this on YouTube. If you're listening, authorlife.com, there's a button that says free tools. You can click on the free tools and you get the story rubric. So and there's right now there's story, nonfiction, and scene. What the story rubric is it is like a grading rubric in school where they're like, hey, this is underdeveloped, this is fair, this is good, this is excellent, and a whole bunch of different categories. So it's a way to like evaluate your story or someone else's story. Catherine and I use this when we do 3-story method diagnostic editing. If you ask us to do a diagnostic, we'll read your piece and then we'll fill out this rubric and talk through it. So we're not going to give you like line notes or like developmental edit notes necessarily, but we're going to just talk to you about like, hey, here's where your story's at. And today we're talking about emotional tone, because we've been working through these. You can go to, if anybody's listening, you can go to past episodes to find out the other ones. But so good. Let's just read excellent. Excellent emotional tone takes the reader on a journey using purposeful and intentional movements. Readers uncover or discover themes that relate to their lives through the emotional arc of the characters. So that's what I want to talk about, because I actually love emotional tone. It's one of my favorite things to talk about. Okay, so Catherine,
Yes.
how would you define emotional tone?
Cool. So like I did prepare for these questions, but now I'm like blanking.
Yeah, it's okay. I actually didn't. I wrote the questions, sent them to you, and then didn't do any preparation. So the story of my life.
Emotional tone, I would think of it as two ways. One, how are your characters emotionally moving through the story? And then two, how is the reader emotionally moving through the story?
Yeah, I really like those parallels. Talk to me about what you mean by emotionally moving.
So if your character is like cold the entire time of the book, it's just like a character arc. You want your character to do something. If they remain the same emotion throughout the entire story, it's kind of boring. It depends on the genre too. There are some genres that, character development is really not there.
See, I disagree. I know people say that specifically when about like legal thrillers or like the Lee Child military warrior, ex-warrior thriller. Um, I grew up reading those thrillers, and there's a lot of emotional tone. Let's camp that though until we get to. I just think it comes in a different place. So
Yeah.
let's just parking lot. That's the phrase that I learned recently. Or let's parking lot that question, and let's go into it's my new term. So yeah, I like what you're saying about. I like the definition you're using about emotional movement. Of the character, and I think it comes into and separating that from the reader. So just like focusing on character, emotional tone kind of comes in those like two places. One is in the scene by scene level, like you want the character to feel something in every scene, and you want the reader to feel something in every scene, right? Like no, if the reader isn't feeling something in a scene, then I really question, like, well, do you actually need that scene? Like,
Yeah.
there's, and I think part of that is that it's so connected to conflict. Like if there's conflict in your scene, there's going to be emotional tone. And we all know that, like, oh yeah, you can't have a scene without conflict. And I would actually say the reason you can't have a scene without conflict is because the reader needs to feel something.
Yeah.
And if the conflict is just a tool to make the reader feel something. So yeah, and the reader, and then the emotion. So on the scene level, but then also on the book level, we need that like emotional journey where the reader is going on. Just curious, when you write a scene, how much do you, I don't think there's a right answer to this. I think every author's different. How much do you plot out the emotional tone before you write the scene?
So I don't plot at all.
Total pantser.
Yeah. The only thing I plot is my world building. Other than that, it's rare that I'll actually plan out a scene. I'll sit there and I'll be like, ooh, I want a masquerade, but I want it to be like creepy people who are like following this person around.
Okay, so you are plotting an emotional tone, just a
Yeah.
general one. You're like, oh, I want it to feel this way. Is that true?
Yeah, I guess. I mean,
Yeah.
I guess that's the most plotting I do.
So this is my theory. This is a working theory I have about pantsers, because I'm a heavy plotter. I mean, I could show you over here. I have a giant spreadsheet of the novel I'm working on right now. I'm a really heavy plotter, and so my theory about pantsers is that you actually are planning, but what you're focused on is emotional tone. You're like, oh, I want this to feel this way, as opposed to like, okay, because, and here's, as a plotter, I think something I've had to learn is that my plot devices, my like, oh, here's my beat structure, or like, here's my layout of scenes, or like, here's my scene construction sheet. All of that is just to ensure emotional tone. That's all it is. It's just a way to be like, okay, I know, like, this is what's I'm not saying to myself. What I'm not saying is that the reader and the character both need to feel something in this scene. So I'm going to make sure that happens by constructing the plot before I write. Because otherwise I might have something that the reader and the character feel nothing. So like I have to like construct it. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I could see that, because I mean, like, I'm not usually writing anything down. I guess my planning would be all in my head. So like when I go for a section, and I do it a lot by the chapter too. So not as much as like little scenes. I'll do the whole emotion for the chapter.
Nice.
So I'm like, this is this section.
Yeah,
so if this reaches that, I'm cool with this chapter being that section. And then sometimes I will go in being like, okay, my characters are going to be doing this, but the reader is going to be feeling this instead. So sometimes it clashes with the emotion of what the characters are, because the reader knows information the characters don't.
Yeah. So I think let's talk about that a little bit too, because I think dwelling on that like break between the reader and the character and what they're feeling, for me, what the character feels, what the reader feels is very connected to how the reader feels about the character.
Mhm.
So if the reader likes the character, then the things that happen to the character happen to the reader if it's done right. Right. Like
Yeah.
if the reader is frustrated with the character's choices, like if the character's making terrible choices all the time and the reader's like, I wish you would just, then sometimes the character being frustrated is actually a benefit to the reader. Does that make sense? The
Yeah.
reader's like, oh, finally, I'm so glad somebody put that stupid character in their place. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yeah.
Either way, the reader's kind of like the character is a vehicle that the reader rides through the story in. Whether or
Mhm.
not you like the vehicle you're in is a different thing, but the reader's a vehicle that, yeah. I mean, you have to like them in some way. I've read a lot of books where I start reading and I'm like, I don't like this person. I don't like this character. And I can't read the book because I don't want to spend days with this character. Right. Like, so yeah. Anyway. What do you think about when you're editing or reading, like reader versus character journey? How do you plot, well, you don't plot it out, but how do you like wrangle those two moving pieces?
So just to make sure I got you right.
Yeah, it was a lot of words. This is word salad. I was gonna throw out a word salad and be like, take that and do things with that.
So how do I, like, as a reader?
Yeah, like when you
Look
approach a
okay.
piece, well, I would think more, I'm actually asking more as like an editor. When you
Okay.
approach a piece and you're like, oh, I know that there's a how the reader should feel and how the character should feel.
Mhm.
How are you like looking at those two things separately, or are you at all?
I I've learned so I did just work with a client, and that was one of the things that she had wanted me to look for was the emotion. So I read each chapter twice. So I read it as a reader and then I went back in as an editor.
Nice.
So I could figure out like, oh, this is that section. This is where I'm supposed to be going. And then as the editor, I could go through and be like, this wasn't working or make this stronger.
Hmm.
And then I could leave notes at the end of each. So they did each scene was a chapter. So for me, at the end of each chapter, I could leave, like in that little space, some
Yeah.
notes where I'm like, hey, this is going in like this direction, or hey, you didn't want your character, you don't want your readers to really hate your love interest. Please change this line.
Yeah, I had one of those recently too, where I was like, this is the piece was fantastic and it was really, really funny. Like I was laughing really hard as I read it. I was literally laughing out loud. But before we started, the person I was editing was like, oh, this is a romance. Well, there was actually confusion on my end. It wasn't, but I thought I was like, oh, I'm supposed to be reading a romance. And the male lead is hysterical, but super whiny. And so I was like, hey, as a reader, I like this is great, but I have no emotional feeling to these two getting together at all. Like I don't I don't want this guy to have any kind of success because he's the worst. So like it's yeah, anyway. It's that like diagnosing. I think you're right. I think a lot of times we need to read the things we're editing, even our own work,
Mhm.
with a separate lens of like how's the reader, like I know how because often when I write I'm in the character's head, or when I edit I'm in the
Yep.
character's head, so it's like you got to step back and be like, how does the reader actually feel about this
Mhm.
piece? Yeah, I had my editor just did that to me because um I was on the novel that I just finished. I had a scene where a woman was contemplating abortion, and I thought I was in the character's head and I was like, oh, like this is what the character is going to share in this scene, this is what the character is going to talk about. And I was like, yeah, I have the character down. And my editor read it and was like, hey, this is like the why is the character not saying anything? I'm like, well, because she's guarded, she's like closed off and she doesn't want to talk about it. And she's like, okay, so let's talk about the reader's experience when the character's guarded not talking. I was like, oh yeah, the reader isn't in the character's mind like I am, especially if I don't put the mind on the page. And so the reader is like having a completely different emotional journey than the character that I think the character is having in this moment. So yeah, anyway, that was Laura who edited that for me, for anybody, for dialoguers that listen to this and know Laura. She was like, Jeff, you like you can't just assume the reader understands what you want them to understand. You actually have to tell them. So yeah, anyway, yeah,
I
those.
have an alpha reader who like he reads my draft zeros. So like I write it and I hand it off and then I stare at him while he reads it.
Oh, that's brave.
And I think he's read everything I've written at this point. So like he knows where I'm trying to go with stuff. And so he'll like make faces just to be like, and I'll be like, what did I do? And he's like, someone Facebook messaged me. And I'll be like, oh, I hate you.
That's awesome. Yeah, every
But
once in a while I'll ask my wife to read something. It's very rare. But every once in a while I'll be like, hey, would you read this for me? Like I had a scene with a lead female character and another female character like joking around at a park. And I was like, this is funny to me, but as I am not female and have never actually lived these moments, I should probably have somebody who has read this. And the character is kind of based on her and one of her friends. So I was like, hey, could you read this for me? Like, but I've learned not to like watch her facial expressions just for that reason. So like, what's wrong? She's like, I was thinking about how I have to go get groceries today. Like, like stay focused on the piece, please. So I'll give it to her and I'll just leave the room. I'll be like, tell me when you're done and tell me what, yeah.
But yeah, he helps me make sure that the like the emotional side that I want the readers to have for the most part is there.
Yeah, it's pretty funny. Okay, so what makes an emotional journey compelling to you?
The characters.
Oh, you got to define that. You can't just say the characters.
Let's see. I think yes, the characters, but what is I don't want to even say theme, but I guess what's the story? So like if the story is something important or hold on.
Are you thinking like stakes of the character's journey?
Yeah. Like I'm trying to think of a book for an example.
Okay.
And I'm like drawing.
I know. Every time I try to think of a book, I'm like, yeah.
Tom.
I can hear Tom from Maine yelling names of books at me right now. Yeah.
So I guess Stalking Jack the Ripper was a book that I read. Super good. I really liked it. In the beginning of the book, she's very like stuck up-ish, like I'm the best. I am a woman who is working on cadavers. I'm doing it in secret. And like you really travel with her as she's like figuring out pieces of who Jack the Ripper is. And she's finding out it's like a family member.
Yeah.
No spoilers. That happens pretty early on in the book.
Yeah.
And so you really get to see like those stakes where she's like, no, it can't be my family members. Like, no way are they the ones who are doing this to people. And so you watch as like each like body shows her more and more of like, it's her family member. And it's good because it keeps building, I guess, the stakes.
Yeah, that's interesting. And so I like that because I'm going to go back to the question, which I like how you're defining that. And I like how you're putting language to that. I don't think I've put that language to that before, but I really like it. The idea, like the concept that it's the stakes the character's traveling through that actually create the emotional journey. We talked about these like military-esque, ex-military thrillers like Jack Reacher that everybody's always like, yeah, there's no emotional tone there. There's no character growth. There's no character change. But as a kid, like I used to love reading Clancy and Reacher and Lee Child and a lot of Grisham and all those books now that people are like, yeah, these are alpha male. I can't remember the Shooter books, what the name of that character is. Bobby Lee, I think. Anyway, I used to read all of those, and it's not, while people are right that Reacher as a character across books is kind of always the same, right? He shows up in the town, he discovers the problem, he beats people up, he solves the mystery, and then he leaves town. It's always kind of the same. There's still deep emotional tone because what the reader ends up connecting to are the stakes that Reacher's trying to solve. So Reacher's character journey becomes less about how Reacher is feeling about all these things, because Reacher is a obelisk of, strength but more about how the world around him is changing, and what happens if he doesn't solve the mystery creates that like emotional tone for each scene. So you almost start like, it's not him that's the vehicle character, but it's the world itself. It's like, okay, we're traveling in this world, and the emotional component becomes like how we connect to this world and how we don't connect to this world. So am I making any sense at all, or is that
Yeah,
just
and then I'd like
gibberish?
to piggyback on that.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, so maybe it's also with like those kind of stories that the emotion from the way the character starts is also what they'd get at the end, but there's still little like
Yeah,
mountains,
there's
and then they
definitely
come
hills and
back
valleys.
to where they were.
Yeah, so there's not overall change, but the like, oh, I like that. So it's not that there's overall change, as if like Reacher is sad at the beginning and then happy at the end.
Yeah,
Reacher is Reacher at the beginning and the end. So there's not overall change, but there is if the mystery is not solved, there will be change. And so we are trying to avoid the emotional wreckage that will be caused if the issue is not dealt with. Does that make sense?
yeah, it does.
Yeah, so that gives you that like, thriller arc of I think Vonnegut called it Man in the Hole, where it's like you start here, then everything goes to crap, and then it fixes itself and you're back out of the hole again. But yeah, anyway, that's interesting. I'll have to think more on that. But I like the idea of like stakes and how stakes impact that emotional journey.
Yeah,
That's really great.
The James Bond, which is like the one that I always hear when people are like, he's always the same. I
Yeah.
mean, like he goes through, he has his love interest, so there's definitely something going on there. Some type of emotion, doesn't have to be connecting emotion.
Yeah.
And then it will like, there's betrayal, of course. So there's that, there's anger, and then he's like back to being James Bond.
Yeah.
So there's little bits.
And there is that, like, again, like, there is, like you're saying, there's that, like, well, if this isn't solved, we're going to stay in the pit of emotional tone. Like, we got to climb out of it. We got to fix it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. What's the best emotional journey you've seen so far in a story you've consumed?
Definitely the second book to Stalking Jack the Ripper.
Okay.
Which is hunting Prince Dracula.
Oh, that's fun.
Yeah, so all of the stuff that happened in book one with the family members and not telling you who it was, she has a lot of PTSD and trauma from it, and she has to work through. No, yeah. But it was
author so talk. Nice. She was murdered. Excellent. Yeah. Anyway.
It was so nice to have that trauma, though, where it wasn't like, look, all of this happened and like the people I knew were being murdered and I'm totally fine. It was like every time she cut into cadavers, she was like picturing some of those scenes again and like was like, am I just as like monstrous as blank family member? Huh. And so that drawing in from like her becoming like herself almost again, but like knowing that she's not the monster that her family was really a cool
cool art.
Thing.
Yeah. That's very cool. Yeah, I was I think my first, that sounds very cool and I'm tempted to read those books. My really good. Yeah, my I've been avoiding emotional tone recently, for at least for the last month, because the book I was writing was super emotional. So I'm like already emotionally constipated in like writing these scenes. So I've actually been like intentionally avoiding one, but I did finish the Netflix series Ozark, and that one gives me all of the feels, the like fear for the characters, the like anger at the decisions they make. So, and I rewatched some of the first season to get into, or some of the last season to get into this one. So I'm about to have some spoilers for Ozark. So fast forward like a minute if you don't want to hear them. There's a scene where the female lead, Wendy, has to give her brother over to a mafia hitman to like kill, a cartel hitman to kill. and she like drives him out to a restaurant, and he has some mental challenges. It's like some mental and emotional challenges. And so it is one of the hardest. It is on the level of like watching them shoot the dog in Old Yeller. It is one of the hardest. And I just I had to stop the show because she takes him to this restaurant, and then she goes to the bathroom, and all the way to the restaurant he's talking about how like he's sorry that he's like caused her chaos, and he's sorry that he's like done this to her family, and he's sorry, and that he, you know, he'll get better and he'll do it, and he'll be, because he's also got an addiction background, and he's doing all the things that like addicts who really want to change and are really struggling with their, you know, addictive behavior are doing, where they're like, I'm sorry that I'm doing this, that I did this to you, and I'll change and I'll get better. And they're doing that all the way to the restaurant. And the whole time she's like, yeah, it's, I know. And then she like puts him in the restaurant, and then she leaves, and she like goes to the bathroom and sneaks out the back. And like, then you see the cartel hitman show up, and then it goes to her driving home, and she just like goes to a parking lot, gets drunk for a day, where she's just like sitting in her car drinking for a day, trying to deal with and I think what makes it so emotionally compelling is it is the fulfillment of a very painful emotional arc, where you really want both of these characters to become the best version of themselves. And it is the admission in the story, like the admission of the stakes, that's like, yeah, this character isn't ever going to become the best version of himself. He's done. And it's that like end of that emotional arc that just like rips your heart out. You're just like, oh, I had such hopes for him. Like I really wanted things to, which again goes back to what we were saying about part of the emotional feeling, I think, has to do with how we feel about the characters and like what we like and dislike about the characters. Because if I didn't see anything redeeming in him, like if I didn't like him as a character, I don't know that my heart would have been ripped out when they had to finally kill him. He was a frustrating character. Like there's definitely like, oh, there's things about this dude that I really want to change, but I wouldn't have had my heart ripped out when they got rid of him. Anyway, that was
I haven't seen the show, but that reminds me of like Mice and Men.
Yeah. Oh, it's very similar. Oh man. Yeah. I remember in high school when I read that stupid book.
Oh my God, it was horrendous.
It's like, oh no. Yeah,
So,
I
like,
had a, yeah.
The Old Yeller, I was like, okay, like he's got rabies. It's, sorry, spoiler alert.
It's all right.
Yeah,
if
like,
you're allowed to spoil movies from the 1950s, I'm sorry. Yeah.
And like, if you haven't seen that by now, yeah.
Yeah, you're not gonna watch it if you haven't seen it by now. So,
but yeah, I was like, he has rabies. It makes sense to put the dog down. Yeah, it's sad. But like in Mice and Men, I was like, why?
Yeah, what are you doing to Lenny? Yeah, it's my kids have to read all these old classics now for school. And so every once in a while I'll go upstairs and I'll like check on them before they go to bed, because we have a rule in our house that you have to read before you go to sleep. So
not that that's oh no, but some of those books.
Yeah, so they're like, my teenagers are always like reading. Recently my freshman in high school was reading Lord of the Flies. And I walk into his room and he's like, and I'm like, they just killed Piggy, didn't they? He's like, they just killed Piggy. I'm like, yeah. But it is that like the emotional tone, like the reason that lands is what, like, you know, you've been saying, is that like we go on this journey with this character, scene to scene to scene, and the author builds up with like Lenny or like Piggy this like anticipation of like, I really want things to go well here. Like I want this to work out for this character. And it's emotionally crippling, because when it doesn't, we're so invested in the scene by scene character arc, where that character is moving and developing in each moment, that when it finally caves, we can't take it. Does that make sense? But like, it's not. And the reason I say that is because I think a lot of times as an author, because I write scene by scene, right? Like I don't sit down and write a book in one sitting. I know some people too. I can't do that. I sit down and I write like 2,000 words. I write like a chapter, and then I move on to the next chapter. And I know that I'll sit down and write that chapter and be like, oh man, this was an emotional chapter. It's like me. But if I haven't done the work in all the scenes before to really take the reader on a journey with this character, by the time I get to that, oh, this was a crushing emotional chapter, the reader's not going to feel it, because they're like, I don't care about this person. Does that make sense? Like, I always start my detective novels. I've got 3 detective novels out, and I started each one of them with the murder, or at least like the villain doing something. Like, you always see the villain first, and not clearly like, oh, he did it, but something that's like, hey, there's something suspicious happening there. And I had to kind of make those super creative and fun in what's happening, because after the first one, I realized, I was like, oh, you don't care about these people yet. So you don't care that he's doing something nefarious. You're like, all right, well, look at that dude. He's kind of an ass. So like, I had to like figure out like, how do I make this scene so off the charts, because I haven't done any of the work to get the reader actually to the character, if that makes sense. Yeah. Anyway.
I have a beta reader right now who is in love with one of my, like, the character who walked onto the page and decided to stay. He wasn't supposed to be there.
Yeah.
And there's this whole section, and she's getting so close to it, and like, it hurt me to write it, but like, I killed one of these characters.
Nice.
Like, horrifically. I burned them alive.
Yeah. Make the reader sit in it.
Like, this close to this chapter, and she's like, oh my god, it's so amazing, this character. I'm like, you're gonna murder me. And I'm like, just waiting for her to get to
this is perfect.
Yeah. And I'm like, are you gonna cry like I did, because that was really rough for me to write.
Yeah, you find yourself asking her questions like, so how do I make you love him more before you get to
a little bit
25?
Yeah, I did add a whole chapter into it, because she was like, I would love to see more. I was like, you got it. Like,
yeah. And I do want to say that, like, it doesn't always have to have these like giant stakes. Like, I think because of what you and I read, we're talking about like murder and, like, finding the serial killer and, killing Lenny at the end of Mice and Men. It is Lenny that dies, right? Lenny's the one.
I think so.
It's been a long time since I read that book.
Yeah, I don't even remember what their names were. So
yeah, you can have subtle, compelling journeys too. Like, my mind goes to another book that I've read several times. I keep coming back to is this book by C.S. Lewis called The Great Divorce, which is very much like a philosophical allegory, but it's very emotionally compelling, because the lead character is observing, the vehicle character, the one that you're like traveling through the story with, is observing all of these conversations. He's literally just watching people talk the whole book. They're on a bus together, and he's watching all of these like personal conversations involved, and he is very confused as to what's happening. And so his confusion is so clear, it creates a compelling emotional journey. Like, it didn't make me cry. Like, I'm not weeping during reading The Great Divorce, but it engages me and keeps me all the way through, because the vehicle characters need to solve the world, the philosophy of the world he's in, keeps me moving through the story. So I just wanted to put that out there, because it's like, I know that not everybody's writing like, thriller, sci-fi, murder things, but to say like, you don't need the high stakes. The stakes don't have to be life or death. They just need to be super important to the vehicle character. If the stakes are important to the character that we're writing along with, they'll be important to the reader too. Does that make sense? Yeah. Any other emotional journeys you've loved recently?
Probably. So I guess a good one would be, oh my gosh, now I can't think of the name of it, but where's that Tom person? It's
Come on, Tom, yell louder.
It's a Korean zombie show. I want to say, and now we're all dead.
Yeah. I don't watch those because I can't handle them. They're too scary.
There,
my kids watch them.
those are, ooh, it depends on the age, but
I know now people are calling they're 18.
oh, okay, cool then.
Yeah,
I've had
I'm
like
old.
the kids I work with, I've had some like 8-year-olds trying to watch it, and I've gone up to their parents and been like, do not allow them to watch it. I was like, that is not a child show.
Yeah, Squid Game is not for children. Yeah.
And the amount of parents I've had to tell that to as well.
Oh, I know. Don't get me started. Um, yeah,
So I would definitely say that one, because it isn't so much of, I guess, murder, but really like that survival stage where you do follow each character. There are some love interests. There's definitely a love triangle. I mean, it's high schoolers, so there's definitely drama, but that drama really like intensifies the amount of survival that they can do, because you have the sports person, you have the Miss Popular. It's all these like people who would not be together who are now stuck together,
yeah,
and they have to figure out how to like overcome the, oh, that's the Miss Gossip and she knows everything of everybody, and like trust that this person will have your back or you're all gonna die.
yeah. Interesting.
So that emotional part is kind of cool. And then you sit there, and as people tick off dying, you're like, ha, or like
Yeah,
it really
yeah.
does.
Depending on how you feel
like,
about them. Yeah,
yeah, where I'm like, good, good.
yeah. That's really funny. Yeah, that's awesome. I did read Under the Whispering Door by TJ Clune. And I should mention that that has a pretty powerful emotional arc where you kind of live with a few characters who are processing, life and death together. And it's again, it's an interesting book because you don't like I mean, I don't assume anybody would like him. He's written to be unlikable. You don't like the vehicle character at the start of the book. And then as he gets to know these other characters and operates in this world, this tea shop that he's in, you do start to really engage with him in a way that like, oh, I don't like who he is, but I like who he's becoming. And that's the kind of like, fulfillment around emotional, like the character, how the character arc connects to that emotional journey.
Yeah.
Yeah. I also think we need to mention that, like, I don't read a lot of romance. I did read a romance novel recently. I don't read a lot of romance, but it is just like raw emotional arc. Like, I think that's why we love romance so much, because it's just pure emotional tone, emotional movement in every scene, every chapter. It's just about, get those raw feelings out and make the reader go on that compelling journey.
Yeah.
Okay, when you edit emotional journey, what are you looking for?
Definitely that it makes sense. If your character hasn't, like, if your character is a cold person and is suddenly super emotional, why?
Yeah, what just happened here? Yeah.
Like, there better be a real good reason as to like why they are suddenly weeping in a corner.
Yeah.
So I really like to make sure that the emotion makes sense for the, like, what is the character going through? What are they doing?
Yeah.
So I'm looking for that to make sure it fits, especially if someone's like, hey, I want this to be a romance. And then you are like, this, they hate each other literally the whole time. Like,
Yeah. I find myself telling authors, you didn't earn that yet. Like, that's the phrase I use with authors. I was like, this is a great moment, but you haven't earned it. Like, you haven't worked up to this. You haven't built me to it. This isn't the journey the character's been on. So you can't do this right now. You have to earn it first. Like, you got to work me toward it before you can. Yeah. I find myself also telling authors a lot of times when it comes to emotional journeys, slow down. Like, you have to make me, because readers are, in general, not all, but in general, distracted. And like, they tend to be, they are paying less attention to the text than you are as the author. That's just a rule. You are thinking about what's on the page more than your reader is. And so if you do something too quickly, like if you have an emotional turn too fast, your reader will miss it. So
Yes.
like you have to, I always tell an author like, hey, after something emotional happens, you need a scene where the character sits in it. Like we just gotta sit in it and feel it for a couple minutes before.
Yep.
It doesn't have to be a long scene, but you need to like give me time to understand like, oh yeah, that was a big thing. Like, you know, it's kind of like leading a kid around sometimes where you're like, you can't just expect the kid to see everything all around. Like if when I take my younger son on like a hike in the woods, I'll be like, look at those trees, isn't that cool? He'll be like, uh-huh. And then I have to be like, no, like look at how the light's moving through those branches. And then he'll be like, oh yeah, that is cool. But you got to like give readers that moment of like, hey, look at this. You felt something here. Sit in it. Yeah.
Yep. My alpha reader calls them Catherinisms. Um, I will go through a section where like my characters are doing great, they're really happy, and then bam, like all hell breaks loose.
Yeah.
And then it's like, okay, back to that. And he's like, you need a
Yeah.
section through here. You did a Catherinism.
Yeah. And it's great to have like an emotional jump, right? Like that's fantastic, especially if you're writing horror or sci-fi where like something jumps out at them and like, you know, you have that jump scare and everybody's terrified and afraid. But then the thing about jump scares in real life is that, yeah, the sudden change to terrified happens quickly, but we don't come off of it right away.
No.
Like we sit around scared for a long time. Like we don't just like, no, everything's fine. Like, and so just understanding that in following scenes, if there's no time jump, you have to sit in that jump scare for a little bit. Like they need to continue being afraid for a while. Yeah. Yeah. Any other tricks? We've talked about a lot of tricks. We've talked about, you know, plotting it out before you like building to an emotional scene. We've talked about paying attention to the emotional journey that your character's on, understanding how your reader might connect to that character to impact the emotional journey. We've talked about a ton of stuff. Any other tricks that come to mind for writers where you can be like, hey, do this thing?
I mean, depending, I guess, on the situation, put yourself in the shoes. Maybe go out and experience it.
Yeah.
I mean, like for my steampunk, I went and bought like corsets and experienced what it would be like to sprint down a street in like garb. So like I know if I'm tripping over my skirts, my character is definitely tripping over their skirt. So I guess like experience if you can
the tangible aspects of what yeah, that's interesting because it makes the emotional connection more real. I think is true.
You can write it easier.
It is necessary right now to say if you're writing a serial killer novel, don't experience killing somebody. Don't do that.
No.
Don't kill things. Yeah. But yeah, but the tangible things that will not harm other people, good to experience those. Yeah. Yeah, I think I would also add tips and tricks. I had one and now I've lost it. It wasn't that important. Oh, that's where it was. I think thinking about, a lot of times we think about world building and like who this character is in the world. I think as you're writing your story, keeping an eye on who's this character becoming and who are they going to be at the end of the story. I don't think you need to know. Right. Like, I'm not saying like, okay, all you pantsers, you have to now have a plot. I don't think you need to know. I think you just need to keep an eye on it. And you need to be routinely asking yourself, like, who is this character becoming? What's happening here? Because like we were saying, even in the Reacher novel where like, you know, he's returning to the status quo. Like that's an important thing you need to keep an eye on because you need to bring it back to the status quo at the end of the novel, right? Like, so it's that kind of who is this character and where do I think that they're going, especially if you're writing a series, because the thing about a series is that in book 1 you take character from A to B. In book 2 you start at B and then you have to take the character from B to C, right? Like, so having that eye on the who is this character going to be at the end of the story, I think is also a good trick for plot, for thinking through the emotional tone, ensuring that your story has a emotional movement, an emotional journey the character's on. Yeah.
And as someone who's thrown out 200,000 words because of that, definitely should think about where your character is going.
It's very funny.
The character never changed. And I was like, that was not intentional. I was like, every character but you changed.
Yeah. Well, I will, like, a lot of times the change I'm writing surprises me. A lot of times I'm like, oh, like I'll get a third of the way through a novel. I'll be like, I didn't realize that's what we were doing, but that's what we are doing. Like we being me and the characters. Like, oh, this is the direction we're going. It's not on my spreadsheet. It's not in my plot, but this is definitely what's happening here. So, like I was writing one of the last detective novel I wrote. I was writing this scene where there's some corrupt cops that like harass the private eyes, and it got really emotionally intense. And I was like, that's weird that I was writing that it got so emotionally intense. And I had to take a step back and think through the character arc of the detective, one of the two detectives. I was like, oh, that's why it's emotionally intense. I've been building to this the whole time and I didn't even realize it. Like this has been something, and it wasn't about the police. It was actually about her being constrained. I was like, oh yeah, this is something that I've been working on that I didn't see until she got handcuffed. And then as she got handcuffed, because I'm writing from the perspective of the character, it gets very emotional. But backing up, I had to make sure, like, okay, is this real from the perspective of the reader? But all that to say is like, I think it's okay to figure out where you're going as you go. You just have to keep an eye on it. Yeah. You just have to like have a side eye. I'm like, what happened back there? Yeah. Anyway. All right. Anything else you want to talk about with Emotional Town?
I think I'm good.
Awesome.
Emotionally drained right now.
No. Emotionally drained. Yeah. Yeah. I have that effect on people. So where can people find you in the world?
So you can find me on Instagram at author.miss.catherinemh, or you can find me at my website, which is scribes-pen.com.
Nice. Awesome. And your services are at scribes-pen.com.
Yes.
People can find your editing services there. They should go look you up. You're a fantastic editor. All right. Well, thanks for doing this with me. I'm going to stop the recording. We can chat a little bit more.